All right, welcome everybody to another episode of the Inside in Tennis podcast. Mitch Michals here. This podcast, part of the Believe Network and available wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, iHeart, to name a few. We're into the tennis off season. Officially in the books now with the ATP Finals in the rear view. A chance to recap that event and talk to one of the prominent writers in the game, definitely in the last several decades. He has written several anthologies about the game of tennis. The definitive Pete Sampras biography over my right shoulder here, and has been covering the game at a high level, been a member and is a member of the Tennis Hall of Fame, inducted in 2017. First time on the show, Steve Flink. Steve, great to talk to you. Really an opportunity and honor for me to get to talk to you here. So thanks for coming on the podcast.
Mitch, thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to our talk.
Yeah, I am too. And I want to start with this too. Like we ended the long season, which, it's a whole nother thing how long the season is. But, at this point in the game, you've covered tennis for so long, not to date yourself here, but is it bittersweet when we finally say goodbye to another season, or is it welcomed and refreshing to get a little bit of a break? Where are we when we get to this November time for you and the season is finally over?
Yeah, I think I like the fact, I wish it could end actually a bit sooner, but from the standpoint of the players, I think it's so important, Mitch, that they get a break. It should be a longer off season, but yeah, I think you look compared to other sports. I think we have it looks like an eternally long season. So I'm not glad it's over from the standpoint of interest, because I never stop getting enthused about watching it. I'm sure you feel that way too. But I look at it from the player standpoint and say they need a break here, and Carlos is scheduled for a few exhibitions in the States here, which worries me a bit. I know he's pulled out of Davis Cup, but I don't think that helped him, by the way, this past year when he played the Exos over here, and then Djokovic beat him in the quarters of Australia. Novak played great, but I think Carlos was susceptible to something like that. So off season is important in a nutshell.
Yeah, I'm with you. I do love the ATP Finals. I think it's a fitting way to end the year. We could just move it up, but I love the best 8 round robin. It's a little different. We talk about monotony in tennis. It's just nice to have a different format. That Alcaraz point you bring up is huge. You can't, there's a little self-serving, which I get, right? The money that's being thrown at these players, it's hard to turn down an exhibition and prioritize rest. But Steve, what do you think about the theory that, he's going for the career slam? Australia is the only one he hasn't won at his young age. But yeah, there is a notion that he has not dedicated a proper offseason with the exhibitions, and it's no coincidence that that's the one slam missing from his trophy case.
Yeah, I agree. That's certainly one of the factors, and maybe he hasn't learned. I've got to believe the people around him and Juan Carlos Ferrero would prefer that he didn't do this, but Carlos is young. He's going to learn, and maybe, just maybe, he's going to prove us wrong in Melbourne. And go over there and win it for the first time, despite his busy end of the season. But we still don't know yet. Yeah. I mean, we know he's out of Davis Cup. We still don't know what's going to happen with those Exos either. Could be that he pulls out of there as well.
Yeah, I'm curious to see where it goes and what happens, and the travel for him's huge, obviously coming over stateside for a few of these in December. But Steve, before we get to the ATP Finals, just chatting with yourself, and again, someone that's covered the game for so long, I wondered, with a lot of people, how they get involved in the sport. I know you grew up New York roots, going to the U.S. Open, getting a chance to go to Wimbledon as a kid. Was it really love at first sight with tennis, or was there a certain seminal moment that really brought you into this great sport?
Well, love at first sight and seminal moment, and that was Wimbledon 1965, Mitch, when my father had gone over to work in London, and so he took me out to Wimbledon that summer of 65. I was about to turn 13, and I'd seen a little tennis prior to that. I'd watched the Davis Cup finals, the challenge rounds the previous couple of years, 63 and 4, and it left an impression on me. But going out to Wimbledon that first time, and my father saw it, I think, more as a cultural experience, but I got hooked, and it really was love at first sight. I just couldn't believe the feeling of being on those grounds and watching the game being played on grass, and the elegance and the beauty of the surroundings. It just hit me pretty hard. And from that day forward, as soon as I got the morning newspaper, I turned to the sports pages, looked for the tennis results. Went to Wimbledon several more times. That year I was at the U.S. Championships at Forest Hills later in the summer. So it really grew out of that, to the point where by the time I was 15, I knew I wanted to be a tennis journalist, which was only a couple of years later in 67.
It's funny too, right? Like the timing of that moment, like you're 13, you're old enough to appreciate it, but you're not too old to where you're already advanced and maybe you don't have time to switch your focus.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting is until then, as a kid, I had been enamored of baseball, and I was a huge New York Yankees fan. I am to this day, and so I was really kind of obsessed with the Yankees and the batting averages and the ERAs and going to Yankee games from the time I was, say, 7 years old. But tennis really, and I never lost that passion for baseball, but tennis really became front and center for me from that day forward in 1965.
Do you think, and that's something I was thinking about as well, like, do you think the stats side of it translates as easily? Because I do hear baseball fans, and I'm a baseball fan too, but people that are into numbers and still fill out their scorecards at games and want to go through it. Do you think there's that side in tennis? I think that might be, we got so many advanced statistics now, but is the numbers side transferable?
I don't think, not to the degree that baseball is. Baseball just seems made for the numbers, and
Right.
and the fans are just they can never get enough of number comparisons, and we don't quite have that luxury, but it's there. But I have to say that when I was getting established, Mitch, I was fortunate to come along when I did, because this is I'm a kid in the 60s and I'm starting full time in the profession in the 70s, and at that time there were no computers yet, no computer rankings yet. When I first started and the ATP came along, they did it first in 73 and the WTA
Right.
followed in 75. But so there were like 4 or 5 of us who were so-called statisticians that all the other reporters would turn to when they needed a head-to-head record or something special like that. In my case, I had this photographic memory that I was really able to put to use, where I could really remember in a crystal clear way with a lot of clarity points from matches, and not the ones from the day before. It could be a year, 10 years earlier, whatever. I was fortunate to have that capacity and that, but it was a different time. It was
Yeah.
just a completely different world than in the 70s, and no internet and very limited television, Mitch, in those days.
Right. I figured that too, reading the Sampras book specifically. Like, there's probably, I'm guessing, a lot of because you're recalling specific points, and you have the luxury of the internet and research now. But how much of that would you say was memory and just being able to relive those big matches and
Yeah,
having that memory?
a lot of it was. A lot of it was. And then I still had notes and I still had tapes, but a lot of it was already
Hmm.
locked in there. And I reviewed tapes in some cases just to get a
Hmm.
different perspective on matches he played, look at it 20,
Yeah.
30 years later and see if I felt any differently than I did at the time. But the key points, the critical points in those matches were right in there in my memory, locked
Yeah.
in. Yeah.
I know the big three came along and he's fourth on the slam total. I just want to mention Pete, growing up a fan of his, and having a Greek background as well. Paul
Ah,
Annacone told me a quote and he's worked with Federer, he's with Fritz now. He's never met a more singularly focused athlete than Pete Sampras. Like, task at hand, this is the goal, get it done. And that says a lot given who Paul's worked with.
yeah, now that's some statement. And no, it showed too, because I remember, for instance, and Pete had a great sense of history of the game. That meant a lot to him, climbing through history, breaking those records. He really wanted to break Roy Emerson's Grand Slam record, and he was singularly focused on it. But I mean, I remember one case in the 1990 when they opened the new stadium in Arthur Ashe Stadium in 1997. They brought back a lot of champions, Don Budge and Lendl, a whole huge collection of them came out on the court, and Whitney Houston sang, and it was quite an occasion. Laver was there, and Pete was going to play the first match, but he didn't come to that gathering of champions because it was a first round match, but it didn't matter. He was he was so tuned into what he had to do in that moment, and obviously he thought that was going to get in his way. Even though it was a first round match that he was very likely to win comfortably, he didn't look at it that way. He left no
Yeah.
stone unturned. So that's a good example, and that's somebody who really did care deeply about the history of the sport.
Prioritizing slams and getting to that number 14 was and is tremendous. In your career too, Steve, and I always ask this question as well. What was the first break, the first paid gig? How did you get your foot in the door in that time in the tennis industry?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, it was 1973. I had started to interview players earlier in 73. I did one with Arthur Ashe in the Albert Hall in London. I was very happy to get that opportunity. But sent it to World Tennis Magazine. They may have known my name a little bit because I've been doing some behind the scenes work with Bud Collins, but they rejected it. They appreciated my sending it, but the timing was off. And then in that June, I went up, I introduced myself to Chris Evert at the French Open, and I interviewed her after she'd reached her first major final at Roland Garros, which she ended up losing to Margaret Court. But it was after we did the interview after her semi, and I sent that to World Tennis, and that was my first published piece, 1973. So that was a thrill. And next thing I know, a checks arrived in the mail, a modest sum, but it felt good to receive that payment, and more importantly, it felt terrific that they were actually going to print the article.
And you look back, you mentioned Chris Evert. It's funny. You look back and you say, like, okay, there's all these great champions. And you look at her performances on clay, and I'm trying to figure out if people ever actually saw her miss a ball on the surface, but her consistency was just out of control. And I think, it's unfortunate that the current generation doesn't realize just how locked in she was, especially on clay.
Yeah, well, look, it was from 73 to 79, 125 matches in a row, and then she loses once and goes on another tear, wins 80 some odd straight again. Yeah, it was her best. She didn't miss much, maybe once every 3 years, and it was her concentration. It was the excellent stroke production that had been given to her by her father, was a teaching pro. There were a lot of reasons for it, and mental toughness and patience, great patience to play on clay. Interestingly, by the end of her career, Mitch, she lost some of that patience. Actually preferred to play on hard courts or hard courts first. Grass would be not quite on the same level. Grass was always a challenge, but my point is that I remember, this brigade of sort of topspin players. The game was changing, and she wasn't enjoying playing on clay as much. So her last year in '89, she didn't go to the French. She skipped the French, rested, got ready for Wimbledon, lost to Steffi in the semis. But that was interesting. But it wasn't until then, right up through 85, 86, when she won her last two majors at Roland Garros over Martina, clay was her terrain.
She's a phenomenal player, one of the many champions you've covered. And another side of this, too, is becoming a young, established tennis professional, getting to interact with legends. You mentioned a few of them, Bud Collins, John Barrett, to name several of them. What was it like to interact with them as a young man in the profession? And what did you learn from those guys and other professionals that, had established names in the game?
I guess I'm glad you mentioned those two, because they were the two crucial figures in my life and helping me get established on different sides of the ocean. As I said, my father was living in London, and he took me out to Wimbledon. That's how I met John Barrett, because my father had met him first at the Queen's Club. And then Bud, and my father also introduced me to Bud Collins originally when I was 17 at Wimbledon 69. And then Bud and I established a friendship after that, and I started working behind the scenes with him. But what did I learn? But I guess I learned in both cases how that you can love this sport, and Bud would often joke about, say, Steve, you and I have never worked a day. We've never worked a day in our lives. But that was a joke. What I learned from both is that you really have to apply yourselves, and that even if you're completely immersed in it and it would have been your hobby, you still have to work at your craft. And I saw how hard I would work with Bud when he was in the booth at CBS at the Open, NBC at Wimbledon, and I'd see how he'd go from how much he prepared for the telecast, and then he'd go straight to his typewriter and do a column for the Boston Globe and put plenty of time into that. And so I saw, okay, this isn't just fun and games. You have to work at it. And same with John. He was so professional. And they both just gave me a lot of excellent advice in that period when I was sort of leaving my teens, heading into my 20s, and also just compassionate. I remember I remember how upset I was when Arthur Ashe lost to Nastasi at the 72 Open, and I was still only 20, and I was in a transition phase, wasn't a reporter yet, and I kind of went off to the clubhouse and I saw Arthur in tears at courtside, head in his hands after losing in 5 to Nastasi, and I went off and I was crying myself because I was a big Ashe admirer. And so I was supposed to be with Bud. I came back to Bud in the marquee at Forest Hills, and he said, "Where were you?" And I explained what happened. And he could not have been nicer about it. But he also explained to me about, what the profession required, and how I was going to have to learn to deal with, as I grew became a pro. But he understood at that point I was not yet a writer. I was a year away from that. So, but the lessons they taught me were countless, both Barrett and Collins.
Yeah. giving you that constructive compassion. But as you said, like, you're a grown up now. It's time for
right,
yeah,
right, exactly. And that was good. But they did it. They did it in a nice way, and but in a way where I could clearly learn what was required.
Well, you wrote a couple books, profiling like the greatest matches, and one of them profiling the greatest match of the 20th century. And I bring that up because there's a lot of great stuff in there. And I'm wondering, with the 21st century just a quarter of the way done, the Sinner Alcaraz match has been buzzing for talk of the town at Roland Garros. So I don't know if there's plans of another book, but it's tough to be, in your case and in my case too, we don't want to be prisoners of the moment, but that was one in real time where it was on everyone's mind that this could be something special and one of the ones in a future book for matches of the 21st century.
Oh, no question about it. That was not hype. I know that TNT covered it, and they were all overjoyed, understandably, to be airing a match of that quality and suspense and brilliance. No, here's the thing. I did originally the greatest matches of the 20th century, and that came out in '99. Then in 2012, I released the greatest tennis matches of all time because the original book didn't have Nadal, Federer, Djokovic in it. So now there was suddenly so much to draw on from the big three. And somewhere along the line here, obviously, I will get in the next edition, and that match will be absolutely celebrated, and it will definitely be one of the matches in the next edition of the book, whenever that might be.
It's like you need this high level of play. You need drama, certainly. And I think, and there's no special sauce to what makes a match iconic, but momentum swings kind of do it. And that's why, especially when Sinner broke back at the end, that was like the cherry on top of this is just another level of a match.
Yeah, I agree. Look, obviously, that match could have ended. It reminds me a bit of Borg-McEnroe in 1980, which is one of my top 2-3 matches. Borg-McEnroe 1980, it's 2-1 for Borg. He's serving for the match, 5-4, 40-15. Suppose he'd won that 6-4 in the fourth, and we all would have said that was a good final. Boy, that was fun. Well, look what unfolded from there. The epic tiebreak, 18-16 for McEnroe, 8-6 in the fifth. And then with this match with Carlos and Sinner, that was well said by you, because first of all, Carlos is down triple match point in the fourth set. That's the parallel of Borg-McEnroe. He's down triple match point. It could have been over in 4, and we would have said that was a really well played match, good for Sinner. And Alcaraz emerges from that dark corner and wins that set, and then served for the match. And as you say, Sinner breaks back. Not only did he break back, he then went up 6-5 and was a couple of points away. He missed a pretty easy forehand at 15-30 that could have made all the difference to give him more match points, and then it ends fittingly in a match tiebreak. So now that was a dandy. They'll have a hard time replicating it. Although the 22 U.S. Open was not far behind when Alcaraz saved a match point and beat Sinner in 5 sets in the quarters of that Open on his way to the title.
We got more with Steve Flink here on the Inside in Tennis podcast, talking to the Hall of Fame writer who's covered the game eloquently for many, many years. And on that same note, as we were just mentioning, Sinner and Alcaraz, that was the matchup. No surprise in the ATP Finals. It was Jannik Sinner, the Italian, defending his title, beating Alcaraz in straight sets. Didn't drop a match, gets all the way through. Didn't drop a set, all the way through to the final. Steve, Sinner on this surface, especially in Turin, indoor hard court, 31 straight. He's just tough to beat everywhere, but there's something special about him on the indoor hard court surface that even Carlos Alcaraz, a man who's had his number, especially in 2025, had a tough time dealing with. So when you look at this match specifically, what is it about Sinner in this head-to-head, even in this head-to-head indoor hard court, what makes him so special?
Yeah, I mean, I just think he's great. I think he's almost as devastatingly efficient on outdoor hard, too. I don't think he showed that in the U.S. Open final, by the way. I thought it was a tremendous performance from Carlos and a somewhat disappointing performance from Sinner in New York. But yeah, this indoors, well, when you hit the ball that hard and that serve it, which is becoming increasingly important in his game, in which he sort of revamped after the Open and altered his toss and made some changes. And so all of that comes into play to make him tougher to beat. And then you're playing in Turin, and obviously he won Paris. He had a great indoor season after the Open period, but it has to be exhilarating to play in front of these home fans that are cheering your every move. To the point, by the way, where they would a couple of times, too many times, they started cheering after he hit a great serve, thinking Carlos couldn't possibly get the return back, and poor Sinner is not trying to concentrate, and the noise, I think, threw him off. But I think it's those factors, the home court advantage plus the surface. But I would
Yeah.
also say this about Turin, Mitch. Crucial win for Sinner because I really think Carlos has been in his head. I don't
Yeah.
want to shortchange Carlos.
Hmm.
Carlos is the most gifted player in the game, but when you look at the 5-match winning streak that took place before Wimbledon, before Jannik turned the tables at Wimbledon, so many of those matches, including the French semis last year, that Sinner could have won. Beijing, where he's serving at 3-love in the final set tiebreak and never won
Right.
another point. He was on the edge of it so many times. Then he ends the losing streak at Wimbledon. He was sick when he lost to Carlos in Cincinnati, didn't complete the match, and then Carlos soundly picked him apart
Right.
in New York. So you looked at that, and that's when we heard Jannik talking about the changes he was going to have to make.
For
The
sure.
sort of and it worried me when he talked that way because I thought you can't forget about your strengths, and you're never going to be Carlos. You are not going to be a
No. Yeah.
virtuoso performer like Carlos. But actually, I think what we saw in turn was the
Mhm.
perfect blend. He threw in the drop shots. He made some subtle changes, but not.
Mhm.
He didn't just totally revamp his game.
Right.
He's still playing basic Sinner powerhouse tennis. But
Yeah.
I think he needed the win to end the year with a win because Carlos, over the course of the year, had won 4 out of 5 against him. If it ended 5-1, another loss in Italy, indoors, in his setting, I think
Yeah.
that would have kind of lingered in his mind in a very dark way over the
Hmm.
offseason. Instead, I think it carries him in with confidence next year. But in turn, I don't think it bothers. I think Carlos had it in perspective and
Hmm.
saluted Jannik for his great play indoors. And Carlos
Hmm.
could excuse himself in a way, not just because of the injury, the injury to his leg where he had to have it the right upper leg wrapped, the
Right.
hamstring, but also because he just had a great year and Carlos had clinched #1 already in the round robin when he
Hmm.
beat Musetti. So I
Yeah.
I think that it was kind of the right way to end the year, and it makes things very intriguing heading into 2026.
Yeah, and that's a lot of good points in there. The fact that Sinner had been beaten by Alcaraz, but those matches weren't beatdowns in a lot of ways. It was just a
Right.
lot of close matches he could have won. They've 10-6 now head to head for Alcaraz. But I
Yeah.
saw the stat they've won the same amount of points, which is just
Yeah.
fitting of how tennis is.
Yeah.
The adjustments, and I think it's so smart. It's like anything Sinner does is measured. We were worried too. Are you going to take a step backward to try to take 2 steps forward? What could that mean? But he saw something at the U.S. Open, Steve. It was the serve. He was not serving well that day.
Right.
And
Right.
that's what he fixed, and that's what he targeted. And yeah, I do think the crowd made a difference. I also think Alcaraz, without able to, hit the drop shot, be effective at the net, things that we probably, to be frank, wouldn't have even notice if he's not playing Jannik Sinner in a lot of ways. But
Right.
that's the pressure these guys put on each other. But there's another point to this, Steve, that Sinner's got a 31-match hard court win streak indoors, and McEnroe has the all-time record. And I never thought, in recent memory, we'd see someone go on such a heater and challenge that record. But it's very possible, and it shows you, again, what he could do here and how special he could be on this surface. So if that record breaks, it'd be another milestone in the cap of Sinner, who is just as consistent as they come. I agree with what you said, that he's not Carlos and he doesn't have the upside. Nobody does, but no one has the consistency in today's game, not even close to Jannik Sinner.
Yeah, or that kind of consistently mixed with just raw, brutal power. And now that he's tinkered with his serve, he can make that even more of a weapon. Although it did strike me that, and they talked a lot about it on the telecast. Jim Courier spent a lot of time talking about it, but the serve went off on him in the final, and he was starting to really struggle with his first serve and his rhythm. And in the second set, he served 2 doubles in a row that led to his getting broken on his way to going down 2-love. But he managed to break back, and despite not serving that well the rest of the way and being under 50% for the set, which he was under 50% for the match, you had mentioned the Open, how the serve cost him the Open final because he was under about 48% of the U.S. Open for the match. But the second set of turn, he was under 50%. That's dangerously low when he's playing someone who returns as well as Carlos, but he still managed to never lose his serve again. The only time he was broken was the opening service game of the second set with the 2 doubles in the entire tournament.
Special player, and along with Alcaraz, these two, Steve, have opened a gap that I know you well know is unlike a lot that we've seen. The stats coming out that the number 3 player in the world, as ranked, Zverev, was closer to like number 1,000 than he was the number 2, and The gap is huge. I guess I want to start with, is this comparable to eras that you've covered? Like, I know we're all prisoners of the moment, especially young fans, and look at this and say, wow, no one's close to these two guys. But is this something you've seen before, or is this total unicorn stuff?
Nothing quite like this. I mean, it's somewhat comparable to the early years of Roger and Rafa. That they were so much, but it was taking Rafa some time, say into 2006, to improve on the other surfaces, and that was his first Wimbledon final in '06, big hard court win early in the year of '06 against Roger. But no, I don't think, especially if they manage to take it through 2026 and 2020. I mean, they want to play 8 straight slam finals against each other, to play 3 slam finals in a row to end the year. In the Open era, we just haven't seen anything like that. That hasn't been matched. That hasn't been
Yeah.
replicated. So in that sense, no. And it's like you almost guaranteed every time they're in a draw together that they're going to meet in the final. Now, look, it could change as early as this year, although I doubt it. It might take into 2027 or beyond, but it's a pretty unique set of circumstances right now. And the timing, of course, it's fascinating timing given that Roger and Rafa are gone and Novak is sort of navigating his way through the latter stages of his career, trying to figure out when he's going to put the racket down and acknowledging how hard it is for him to beat them now, despite
Yeah.
the fact that he did beat Alcaraz in 4 sets at that Australian Open. And even if Carlos was uh, not in sublime form, that was still an impressive feat from Novak.
Yeah, Novak navigating this is interesting because you've covered champions and this is the first time we've ever heard him even acknowledge that, look, I have guys that are better than me, which is a big admission for a guy as proud and deservedly so confident. But you've covered champions that they get to this point and that's it. I'm done. They could still play as Novak can still play. And then there's also players that want to keep going, even though they know that they're maybe not going to win majors anymore. So I don't know how you forecast this going, but it's an interesting state to be in when you've won and you've built this GOAT resume, but you might be able to honestly say, look, the best is behind me.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I've got very mixed emotions about it. Someone who admires Djokovic enormously, because you want to see the great players go out as close to the top as they can. Now, he had a remarkable year to get to all 4 Grand Slam semifinals, win 2 titles to go up to 101, which puts him 2 behind Federer in the chase for overall titles, and Connors being in first place with 109. But I don't think Novak's going to be happy. I mean, talks about the Olympics in 28. I get it. He'd love to go back. But is he going to? It's going to depend a lot on what can we get from him in 2026. Is he back in all of those semifinals again, or does he start to lose a few fourth rounders or quarters? Is it? There's a certain standard you want
Mhm.
to, and that's why I thought, to get back to Pete Sampras, was so great, was that he found a way after a slump. He had won Wimbledon in
Yeah.
2000 to. That was for what was his record 13th Grand Slam title and his 7th Wimbledon. And then, of course, he didn't win a title. He had a 33 tournament drought, and he came back and won the Open in '02 when everybody was writing him off. And that proved to be his last tournament. But that is rare. I haven't seen that in any other case. I haven't seen anything like that. And the reason it happened was, in his case, he took his time. He didn't decide immediately after the Open, I'm leaving. Took him months to decide, well into the next year. And then he
Yeah.
said, no, I'm done. But he was able to
Mhm.
therefore go out on top with a
Mhm.
great triumph over Agassi and win the
Yeah.
Open. I'm sure that Novak would love something like that.
Yeah.
Novak, the option he might have had, Mitch, would have
Right.
been to win that Olympic title in
Mhm.
Paris over Alcaraz, a spectacular 2 tiebreaker match, and say then, I've completed the entire cycle, I'm done. And
Yeah.
I think a part of him might have liked to have done that, but he's just so determined to stretch it as long and as far as he can.
It's tough. I mean, he loves the game, and that's where it comes from. Like, he loves being a tennis player and the challenges that tennis brings. But also, and I love Pete obviously too, and I know Novak looked up to him, and maybe wants to emulate that feat too. But when you retire on top, it might be a little early. You might have the other side of it, like, I still have something left in the tank. And
Yeah,
we're
well, you're
talking about a guy who, again, like in Novak, he was the third best player, big game, big matches. He didn't even play a lot of tennis, so it's a tough one to know when exactly to walk away.
It's true, but he sees that it's getting the physical challenge, the duress of it all. He's seen that it's getting tougher, And
Right.
he also knows that it's hard to get yourself in that optimal mental state. Like he was in, for instance, when he beat Musetti to win Athens. I hadn't seen him look that animated and that determined on a court and that passionate for
Yeah.
a long, long time. And it was
Right.
great. It was great to see it. But that's
Yeah.
harder to draw on that all the time now. But you're right.
Yeah.
When you win it, then there's that party. You said, "Well, why couldn't I do it again?" But
Yeah.
when you're 38, like Novak is,
Yeah.
he's realistic.
Yeah.
In the end, I think he'll make a wise choice. I don't think he's going to let himself get beat up too much to the point where he'll feel like he hung around too long. That won't happen.
It's a good point, though, about the big two rivalry and the dominance that Nadal wasn't an equal to Federer yet. He had to kind of get there when we have Sinner and Alcaraz are equals. And if it keeps going before, like in the history, Novak Djokovic came up, other players have come up, one more year of this, and I might say, okay, we've got a seismic gap that we haven't seen before. So we'll see. It's going to be tough to challenge these players. You have to be able to do a lot, and you have to be ultra consistent. And I wish them the best, but we haven't seen it so far.
No, and I mean, we don't know what the upside is going to eventually be for, say, Ben Shelton. We don't know how fast and furiously Fonseca will grow
Yeah.
as a player. He certainly has the right mentality, but all of that is going to take some time. For instance, I can't see Ben. I'd be shocked and thrilled if he did it, but I'd be very
Yeah.
shocked if Ben won a major next year. Next year, I'm saying. So
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I guess my prediction right now, Mitch, would be that these two will meet, barring injuries. They'll meet in all four Slam finals again next year and probably split them again, by the way.
Yeah, probably. Just putting a bow on the ATP Finals, the other stories that stood out, and just a couple things I wanted to mention. Shout out to Felix Auger-Aliassime, Steve, who finishes the year top 5, gets to that semifinal, and really was in danger of dropping out of the top 30. Talk about a beast on indoor hard court. If you take Jannik Sinner out, it's probably been Felix. It has been. He's been the most consistent with the wins this decade. But for Felix to find it, and obviously still chasing those top 2, but this is a player that had a lot of hype and a lot of gifts. To get to the top 5 spot, Steve, it kind of feels like where he should be, where he belongs.
I think so. I mean, I was glad to see him finish the year 5, Mitch. And we saw him back in the semis of the Open in 2021 against Medvedev. He's had a lot of ups and downs since, and I think sometimes he's appeared to me to almost lose interest. Not that he's not trying, but the passion is gone, and he's not playing up to the top of his game. And so he ended the year strong, and I hope that tells him, okay, I belong in this territory.
Yeah.
And the game is changing now, and we've got two great players at the top, and we've got Novak still very much in the picture, but why can't I take my place?
Right.
Why can't I move from 5 now and try to push? I mean, he's beaten Zverev the last couple of times, for instance. So, I mean, Sasha's still at 3 and Novak's at 4. And I think Felix's goal for next year should be to say, look, why can't I at least be 3 in the world and challenge these guys? And maybe if I work hard, I steal a major somewhere along the way. That should be the attitude at the least.
Yeah, we want to see him keep it going and not fall back. But a great finish, a great year all around for Felix. And then, of course, the other story, it was just the perfect symbolism for what tennis is and can be, was Alex de Minaur's 24 hours. What a couple of days he had from going to as down as it gets. No shame in losing to Musetti. Obviously, he played a great match. He was fighting to get to the tournament. Rallies late in front of his home faithful. But de Minaur's down in the dumps. He talks about having to get serious and win these matches. And then he goes out and beats Taylor Fritz the next day, gets some fortune, and makes the semis. So what tennis can do, right? The highs and lows of the sport, it's just phenomenal.
Well, that's also the best feature of this tournament. There are flaws in any round robin. I don't like seeing. What I mean by that is I'm not happy about a player, whether it's de Minaur in this case or anybody else, who loses twice in his round robin group, but still is able to make the semis because the 2 other guys at 1 and 2 as well. It's not his fault. But what I like about it is that he takes that devastating loss to Musetti, and you're right, he didn't play badly, but maybe a little tight in the end. He couldn't serve it out. And it was sort of cumulative because he had lost so many tough matches this year. When he lost to Felix at the Open, he was very upset with himself there for not pushing it into a 5th, and he thought he could have won that match. And so it was sort of residual. It was residual. There were so many other instances like that. So then to get that opportunity to clear his head and go out and beat Taylor Fritz and play a terrific match, and then play as well as he did, by the way, against Sinner. It was a great first set. and he ends up losing, I guess, 5-2. But
Yeah.
he was right with him up to 5-all and fending off the break points and playing beautifully. So yeah, he goes out of the tournament, Mitch, with an entirely different outlook than he had midway through it. And it's nice to see it because he's such a pro and he's such a. What can you not like about de Minaur? There's no nonsense. There's no shenanigans. He just plays the game like a pro, and I find him very likable because he's so earnest.
Yeah, I totally agree. He just puts the work in. He does it the right way, as they say. So we like to see him do well and wish him the best in 2026. A couple more things with Steve Flink here on the Inside in Tennis podcast, talking to the Hall of Fame writer about the 2025 season and looking ahead to 2026 and some other general tennis topics. You brought up Shelton and the topic of American tennis, right, Steve? It's kind of, it's a tortured situation to talk about because on one hand, that major streak still exists. Roddick in 03, which everybody knows about the Open, with the US Open was the last time. But you got to honestly look at things, right? The depth of the game on the American side is as strong as it's been in recent memory, but it shows you how hard it is to win a major, especially when you have these two behemoths at the top.
Yeah, it's much more your latter point. That's what really matters. I don't think these guys should be knocked for it. I mean, for instance, Fritz has talked so poignantly in the last couple of years about how he won't leave his career satisfied if he doesn't have a Grand Slam title. He's demanding it of himself. I admire that in him and the fact that he's got on this quest. He might not get there, but at least it's uppermost in his mind. But how much of it is his fault and how much of it is that he is just outclassed and that the other two are just so great that no matter what Taylor tries, he had the win over Carlos in Laver Cup. But and he almost beat him. He came very close in Turin. He played a great match against him there. The Sinner matchup is worse for him. Ben is different though. I think Ben is different than Taylor because I think when he eventually peaks, I think his peak will be higher than what we've seen from Taylor, as great as Taylor is, and therefore I think I just think he's the one. I felt that for some time that he would be the American that ends that drought that goes back to Roddick at the 03 U.S. Open. So it's going to be interesting to follow. But my point is that people shouldn't be too critical of Fritz. I mean, if we go, in other words, we go another year and Fritz doesn't win one next year, and Shelton gets to a semi or two, and that's it.
Yeah.
They shouldn't be knocked. They should not be knocked. The other two are all-time greats.
Yeah, you get to top 10 in Fritz's case, or top 5, Shelton top 10 this year as well. First ATP Finals appearance. It's not a bad year. Look who Shelton lost to in the first 3 majors of the year. He got hurt at the U.S. Open, but he's running into the top guys. Man.
Yeah, exactly. And look, and in the case of the French Open, I thought Ben gave a really good account of himself in the 4-setter against Carlos.
Yeah.
So, and he didn't play badly in those Sinner matches either, so... And his match with Sinner in Turin was better than the one in Paris. He improved upon that. And so it looked to me like he was sort of shaking off the rust and starting to find his best tennis again. So I think Ben will be in the thick of things in Australia. I think he'll have another good Australian.
We'll see who can maybe challenge. I mean, there's, a guy I've always liked, Jack Draper. If he's healthy enough, can he challenge and make things interesting? The Fonseca train is going to keep rolling, but is he advanced enough in his career? We'll see. We're going to try to find contenders. There's a lot of young talent in the game, and it's all about development, right? So there's players, Steve, I think you'd agree, you're buying, but it's probably going to take time to get to that elite level.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm convinced that Fonseca will. He's just so young. We just need to give him a little more time. But he made some real inroads this year. Opened the year strong, closed it strong. And you can see it's almost tangible, that drive, determination, excitement he's got. And he's one who's thinking big, dreaming big. Not all of them do. He does. And there's something extraordinary about him. And I know there was a lot of so-called hype around Fonseca early in the year with Australia and everything, but he's going to live up to that. It's just going to take a little more time. But I do think he'll make a leap in 2026. We'll see him. I'd be really surprised if he didn't end next year in the top 20, pushing toward the top 10.
Yeah, I know. It's fun to watch these players on the rise where we know we're buying in early, we're seeing them, and we're seeing the early stages. And looking back, we'll be like, remember when they were just on the way up. So I know you have more experiences with that than I do, but it's still kind of cool.
Yeah, it is. It's an exciting time in the game. And look, I mean, we're so fortunate because I never would have dreamed that we would have this era of the big three ending, and then have these two step in precisely when they did. You couldn't have written the script.
Yeah.
Because I think the public, particularly more with the men's game, Mitch, than the women's, because the women have had they had a lot of people this year who were stars
Yeah.
between Maddie winning the Australian Open and Coco at the French and
Yeah.
and Iga at Wimbledon and Sabalenka at the Open. A lot of top players winning.
Yeah.
They haven't had the rivalries, in other words, that we've seen
Yeah.
with the men. But I think the public has grown accustomed to that with the men. Therefore, Alcaraz and Sinner,
Yeah.
they're going to each have their fan bases, and they're going to each keep pushing each other to the hilt and forcing each other to play different brands of tennis. So there's so much to look forward to. So even if those other guys don't break through, I'm absolutely fine if we see four finals from them next year, Alcaraz and Sinner, particularly if there's some fluctuation in the outcomes. I mean, I wouldn't want to say. I mean, look, if it was 4 for Carlos, it would mean he's won the Grand Slam. So that's exciting too. But I think it's better for the game if there's a little back and forth, which is why the Turin result to me was important for Sinner.
Yeah, we're going to have 3 players in Sinner, Alcaraz, and Iga going for career slams next year. Carlos and Iga in Australia, and Sinner and Roland Garros. So, they're already built Hall of Fame careers, but it's that huge milestone.
No, it is a big milestone, and she'd be worthy of it. I worry about her though, because Wimbledon was not. She did not expect to win it going in, despite being in a grass court final, losing to Pegula on the way to Wimbledon. If you'd asked her at the start of the tournament, she would and told her, you know what, you're going to hold this crown in 2 weeks. I can guarantee it. She would have laughed. She would have said, "That's very nice to hear that, but I'm not so sure." Well, then to play as many good matches as she did, leave aside the final against Anisimova when Anisimova obviously couldn't meet the moment.
Right.
But Iga just played a lot of great matches at Wimbledon, and I thought, wow, at that point, I thought she's probably going to win the Open too. And I thought it was going to be that big a lift. And then Anisimova picks her off there. Then she doesn't qualify has a disappointing year-end championships. In between, did okay. But I feel like now the progress that she made psychologically by winning Wimbledon, it's not been taken away totally. And she'll go to Australia with a good attitude. And she was 1 point away from the final this past year. Maddie saved a match point against her. Keys did in the semis. But I'm really curious to see, aren't you, to see how Iga responds in 26 to what was still a great year, but ups and downs and a couple of losses, to Anisimova after beating her in that Wimbledon final.
Right. I'm curious, in addition to what you said, the fact that winning Wimbledon, crown achievement, it's always a great year when you win Wimbledon. Doesn't matter what else happens. But it overlooked and overshadowed, deservedly so, that she got knocked off the mantle at RG. So let's see if she can get back up and pick herself up, because that is still, I mean, until it continually happens, it's her tournament, but a little different situation going into Roland Garros for her, not as the defending champion.
Could not agree more. That's going to be really interesting, particularly if she hasn't won let's say that she doesn't win Australia and she loses in the quarters or semis of Australia and has decent results in the winter and spring, and then maybe an okay clay court season, not necessarily dominant. Does she go back and win it? Because she played 2 great sets against Sabalenka in the semis this year, but then got blitzed in the third. And the question's will that leave any kind of...
We've seen that, right? Like, we've seen her lose, not going away, but we've seen her run out of steam at times. And she's a tremendous champion, and I'm not writing her off by any stretch, but she is also someone that goes with her confidence. Like, when she's riding high, she can dominate anyone, including the very best. So hope she gets it back.
So true. And that's what's going to be interesting about Roland Garros, because I always feel like she puts an inordinate amount of pressure on herself, maybe more than a lot of the other times. Sabalenka, for instance, has learned, even though she came away with 1 major this year and had to settle for some narrow misses elsewhere, like the final of Australia, the 3-setter against Keys, and the tight loss to Anisimova in the semis of Wimbledon, and and losing that heartbreaker to Coco in the wind in Paris.
Yeah.
But I feel like she's kind of learned, even though there are moments and she snaps at her coach, and we know that side of her, but she's actually learned to enjoy herself more. Poor Iga, I feel like there are times when the weight of the world is on her shoulders and she's demanding a lot of herself. She really wants it so badly. And sometimes I think that gets in her way. And as you say, when she's confident and things are rolling along, then of course she moves past that and wins convincingly. So it's going to be fascinating to see what her form is like in 26.
Well, Steve, this is always a blast to talk to, historians of the game, people that have covered it at a high level. This is a blast getting to chat with you on the podcast. The last thing, though, is there's still tennis. You got Davis Cup going on. I know it's not the same as before, so we're going to be locked into Davis Cup, the different format. But did you have any story or any memories of the Davis Cup in your heyday? Anything that stands out memory-wise?
Well, yes, I was very lucky to go in 72. My father was still living in London at 72. It was a few months after the Bud Collins incident at the Open, where I had to learn to grow up after Arthur Ashe had lost his final to Nastase. And I was living with my father in London at the time. He allowed me to go on a press junket, you could call it. British photographer organized a kind of a cheap airfare and hotels, a whole package deal to go to Romania. So the U.S., I was able to go there, leave college for a few days, and fly over to Romania from London to Bucharest. Saw the famous U.S. victory over Romania, where Stan Smith almost single-handedly won it for the Americans, and I was so lucky to have been there at age 20 to witness this, and that it was much more than the tennis. It was the outrageous line calls from the Romanian officials. Somehow the Americans winning, and Smith telling me how he never thought they would win when they went over, but he beat Nastase and Tiriac. He won the doubles as well, despite blatant cheating on behalf of the Romanians. So, but it was a singular experience, and one that I cherish to this day. 1972, U.S. over Romania in Bucharest.
Yeah, I like it. I like that story. It's very, very good and inspiring. The last Davis Cup story I got on this podcast was Jimmy Arias talking about a melee that took place in Paraguay. So
yes,
we can balance it out. Yeah, we can balance it out on this show.
But that was sort of comparable a bit to Sampras going, although this was even more remarkable from Smith. But Sampras, I wasn't in Moscow when the Americans beat the Russians in 95, but Sampras, again, he won 2 singles and a doubles with Todd Martin, and he almost single-handedly led the U.S. past Russia that year too. But I wasn't present for that. I was there for the 72 American triumph, and I'm glad I was.
Well, Steve Flink, we appreciate you on the show. One of the prominent writers in tennis, 2017 member of the International Tennis Hall of Fame. Look forward to following your work in the years to come. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Can't wait to do this again soon.
Yeah, Mitch, I'd love to come back. Thanks for having me.
That was Steve Flink. This was the Inside In Tennis Podcast. We are available on all your podcast platforms. Just search Inside In Tennis Podcast on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, Amazon Music, wherever you get your shows. The show pops right up. You can subscribe so you get every episode automatically downloaded. And if you'd be so kind to write a review or give a 5-star review or a nice rating, we would appreciate that as well. Follow the YouTube channel at Mitch Michals for full video episodes, and you can see this with Steve Flink as well as our outstanding catalog of guests. More content to come in the weeks to follow. The tennis offseason may be here, but this show will go on with some great interviews and chats with people in and around the game. So for Steve Flink, I'm Mitch Michals. This was the Inside In Tennis Podcast. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you soon.